Sometimes life gives you everything, power, success, and still manages to take away the one thing that truly matters. For Edward Blake, one of New York's most successful millionaires, that truth hit him like a storm the night he stepped into a quiet restaurant in Portland. He thought he was only stopping for a meal. Instead, he found his first love again. But this time, she wasn't alone. Beside her sat a little girl who looked up at another man and called him Dad. Edward Blake had always been a man of precision. To outsiders, he seemed untouchable, a millionaire who moved through life like every decision was a calculation already solved. His suits were pressed, his office immaculate, his time divided into neat blocks that left no room for surprises. But that illusion cracked the moment Hazel stood in his office, her fingers trembling around a folded paper. She wasn't just an employee or a fleeting presence in his life. Hazel had been the only woman who had managed to break through his armor. She knew how to laugh in a way that disarmed him, how to make him see the world outside of numbers and contracts. Yet when she said those words, pregnant, Edward felt only walls closing in. To him, children represented chaos, a risk he couldn't measure, a variable that didn't belong in the life he had built brick by careful brick. The silence after his ultimatum stretched like glass about to shatter. Hazel, who had once seen warmth in his eyes, saw nothing but steel. She had imagined 100 outcomes to this moment, tears, relief, arguments, but she had never imagined cold indifference. And so she walked. Not because it was easy, but because she knew deep down that she couldn't beg a man to love their child. The city swallowed her as she left New York. Portland was nothing like Manhattan's glass towers. The mist clung to her hair, the sidewalks smelled faintly of coffee, and the nights were quieter, lonelier. She rented a small apartment above a cafe where the heater rattled and the walls seemed to breathe with the neighbors' laughter. She worked nights at a diner, her hands raw from washing dishes, her smile practiced for customers who left coins barely worth the effort. And yet, within that struggle, Hazel discovered something Edward never would: resilience. She painted when she could, turning scraps of canvas into windows of her soul. Her brushstrokes carried grief, but also a fierce hope. She painted women who stood tall despite the shadows, children who looked at the world with unbreakable wonder. It was as if her unborn child was guiding her hand, whispering to her that she wasn't just surviving, she was building something. When Lily was born, Hazel cried not out of fear, but relief. The baby's cry filled that cold hospital room like sunlight through a cracked door. Hazel kissed her tiny forehead and whispered the name she had carried in her heart for months: Lily. She was more than Edward's eyes or Hazel's lips. She was proof that love could endure even when abandoned. For Edward, life went on. He signed deals, shook hands, and added another zero to his fortune. But no matter how far he rose, he could never erase the echo of Hazel's footsteps as she walked out of his office. Somewhere inside him, beneath layers of denial, he knew he had lost more than a woman. He had lost a future. 3 years later, fate intervened in the most ordinary of ways. Edward was in Portland for a business meeting that meant little to him: another acquisition, another chance to expand his empire. With an hour to spare, he stepped out of his car, adjusting the cuffs of his coat, irritated by the drizzle clinging to the streets. His assistant suggested a nearby restaurant known for good coffee and quiet charm. Edward, uninterested in charm, walked in expecting only caffeine. But charm found him anyway. The restaurant was small, the kind of place where mismatched chairs and flickering candles made the air feel softer. The walls doubled as a gallery, lined with paintings that seemed to breathe emotion. One canvas, in particular, rooted Edward to the floor. A little girl, her head tilted in curiosity, her eyes wide and brown, gazed out at him. There was something haunting in that stare, something familiar. His pulse quickened when he saw the signature, Hazel Moore. It was as though the years between them folded in on themselves. Memories of her laughter, her voice, her hand in his, things he had buried under contracts and skyscrapers, rushed back with violent clarity. And then the door opened, and Hazel herself stepped inside. She hadn't seen him yet. Her sweatshirt was smudged with paint, her hair loose, her smile soft as she spoke to the little girl beside her. That child no older than 3 skipped ahead, her curls bouncing, her voice ringing clear as she pointed at the portrait. "Mommy, that's me," she said, pride lighting her small face. Edward felt his breath catch. His chest tightened in a way he hadn't known it could. The resemblance was undeniable. Every tilt of her head, every flicker of expression belonged to him. His daughter, his child. But before he could move, another man rose from a nearby table. He was tall, dressed casually, with the easy confidence of someone who belonged. The girl ran to him without hesitation, her tiny arms wrapping around his neck. And then Edward heard it, the word that split him apart. Dad. Hazel froze when she saw Edward standing there, her green eyes sharp and unreadable. She placed a protective hand on Lily's shoulder, her body angled like a shield. Edward wanted to speak, to explain. But no sound came. He was no longer the man in control of everything. He was a stranger in a restaurant, watching the life he could have had unfold without him. That night, Edward didn't return to his hotel. He wandered Portland streets, the drizzle soaking through his coat, his mind replaying the image of Hazel and the little girl. He thought of the ultimatum he had given, the words he had said without flinching. The baby or me? Now, years later, he realized the cruelty of it in its full weight. He hadn't just lost Hazel. He had lost the right to hear his daughter call him father. And yet, he couldn't stay away. He began orbiting Hazel's world without announcing himself. He lingered outside her gallery, pretending to admire the window displays when he was really searching for glimpses of Lily. He spotted them at the market, Hazel's hands balancing groceries while Lily tugged at her sleeve. He watched from across the park as Hazel sketched under a willow tree, her daughter spinning in the grass, her laughter carrying through the breeze. It was in a bookstore cafe that fate gave him his first crack of light. Hazel was flipping through an art magazine while Lily colored at the table. Edward sat 2 chairs away, pretending to read. When Lily dropped a crayon, it rolled under his chair. She scampered over, looking up at him with those same brown eyes he had seen in the painting. "Hi," she said softly. Edward's voice caught, but he managed to smile. "Hi there." She held up her paper proudly. "It's a dragon, but it's a nice dragon. It doesn't eat people, it protects castles." His throat tightened. "That sounds like a very important job," he told her. Her grin widened, and she skipped back to Hazel, who was already staring at him. Their eyes locked hers sharp, his filled with an ache he couldn't hide. She didn't say anything, didn't smile, but she didn't leave either. Later that evening, Edward received an email. Just one. Line: "Stop following us. If you want to help, say it. Don't hide." Her words cut deeper than any accusation. She wasn't cruel, she was honest. And honesty was something Edward had not given her in years. For the first time, he felt a sliver of hope. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a door, barely open. And for a man who had built walls his entire life, Even a crack of light was enough to make him step forward. The park on Saturday morning smelled faintly of fresh grass and wet soil after a night of rain. Parents pushed strollers, dogs tugged at leashes, and children ran across the open lawn chasing bubbles that floated like fragile jewels. Edward stood at the edge of it all, hands clenched in his pockets, staring at the bench where Hazel sat beneath a willow tree. She looked calm, composed, her back straight as though holding herself together required discipline. Lily darted nearby, her laughter ringing out as she spun in circles. Hazel didn't wave him over. She simply lifted her chin slightly, a subtle gesture that told him he could sit if he wanted. He walked slowly, his heart hammering harder than it ever had before a business deal. He sat down, leaving space between them, careful not to let his arm brush hers. For a long time, they didn't speak. They just watched Lily chasing dandelion seeds that drifted across the field. Edward's throat burned with words he wanted to say. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I've missed everything," but he knew none of them would be enough. He had spent 3 years in silence. Now he would have to earn every single word. It was Hazel who broke the quiet. "She likes dragons," she said softly, her eyes never leaving Lily. "Not the scary kind. She says they protect people who don't have swords." Edward let out a small breath, something between a laugh and a sigh. "She told me that once, at the cafe." Hazel turned her head slightly, one eyebrow raised. "She doesn't usually talk to strangers." "I was surprised too," he admitted, glancing at the little girl twirling with wild abandon. "But I'm glad she did." Hazel studied him out of the corner of her eye, her expression unreadable. He could see her weighing every word, every movement, against the memory of the man who once forced her to choose. "She asked me last night who you are," Hazel finally said. Edward's chest tightened. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were someone I used to know, someone who might want to know her too." The words hit him harder than any boardroom insult ever had. They weren't an invitation. Not yet. They were a test, a line drawn in the sand. Hazel wasn't ready to call him a father, and she wasn't ready to let Lily know the truth. But she wasn't shutting the door either. "I don't want to hurt her," he said, his voice low, almost breaking. "Or you." Hazel finally turned to face him fully. Her eyes, once so open and trusting, now carried years of exhaustion and strength. "Then don't disappear again. Whatever you decide, make sure it's not temporary. She doesn't need another man walking in and walking out of her life." Edward nodded, the words cutting deep but anchoring him. "I won't leave. Not this time." That was the beginning. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't trust. But it was the first fragile step toward something that could be rebuilt. The weeks that followed were cautious but steady. Edward moved carefully, never overstepping, always asking permission. Could he walk them home from the gallery? Could he bring Lily a children's book he thought she might like? Could he stop by Hazel's studio to see her new paintings? Hazel rarely smiled at him, but she didn't always say no. Trust was being rebuilt, brick by brick, word by word. Lily, however, took to him with the kind of curiosity only a child could have. She asked him questions endlessly about animals, about why the sky was blue, whether he knew how to whistle. Sometimes she called him Edward. Sometimes, simply, that man. He didn't mind. Each word was a step closer than silence. But just as Edward began to believe he might earn a place in her world, everything was thrown into chaos. It started with small things. Lily came home from daycare more tired than usual. She turned down her favorite meal, pushed away her toys, and complained about pain in her legs. Hazel assumed it was a growth spurt or exhaustion from playing too hard. But the next morning, Lily couldn't stand without crying. Her small body trembled with fever, her face pale and drawn. Hazel rushed her to the clinic, panic clawing at her chest. Doctors ordered tests, blood work, scans. Their voices dropped low, their expressions grew grave. Hazel sat in the sterile hallway, clutching her daughter's shoes in her lap when the word finally came. A rare autoimmune condition. Aggressive, but treatable with immediate intervention and a compatible plasma donor. Her body went numb. She had survived years alone, built a life brick by brick. But nothing prepared her for this moment. Nothing prepared her for the thought of losing Lily. Edward arrived, within an hour of her call. Hazel hadn't wanted to dial his number. Her pride screamed against it, but fear left her no choice. When he walked into the hospital, she saw something on his face she had never seen before. Terror. Not for himself, not for his company, but for the little girl lying in the bed behind them. "What do I need to do?" he asked without hesitation. Hazel explained through shaking lips the condition, the urgency, the donor match. Before she could even finish, he cut in, "Test me." And fate, cruel as it had once been, turned merciful. Edward was a near-perfect match. The procedure was scheduled immediately. He donated not once but twice in the same week, pushing his own body to the edge, ignoring his assistant's calls, refusing the comfort of a hotel. He slept in the hard chairs of the hospital lounge, his face pale, his energy drained. But he never left. Hazel had never seen him like this, vulnerable, human, unguarded. When Lily finally opened her eyes after the transfusion, weak but smiling, her voice cracked as she whispered, "You're still here." Edward leaned forward, tears in his eyes. "I told you I would be." Hazel stood in the doorway, watching them. The machines beeped softly, nurses shuffled outside, but inside that small hospital room, something shifted. The man she had left behind 3 years ago, the man who once made her choose, was gone. In his place was someone new, someone who had finally learned what love required: sacrifice. Life after the hospital wasn't the same, and Hazel knew it never could be. Once Lily was discharged, she carried her daughter home wrapped in blankets, her small body still fragile, her future uncertain but hopeful. Edward drove them, his hand gripping the steering wheel as though the act of driving was his way of holding them safe. He didn't leave after that. He became part of their days, not loudly or arrogantly, but with a quiet persistence. He picked Lily up from daycare when Hazel had long gallery meetings or double shifts at the diner. He brought over groceries without being asked, always slipping Lily's favorite snacks into the bag. He cooked simple meals: pasta, scrambled eggs, grilled cheese, asking Lily what she preferred, and laughing when she insisted he cut the sandwiches into stars. Hazel stayed cautious. At night, when Lily was asleep, she often found herself leaning against the kitchen counter, arms folded, watching Edward read bedtime stories with exaggerated voices. A part of her still braced for disappointment, for the old Edward to resurface. But he didn't. He showed up, again and again, until even Hazel stopped counting. One evening, Hazel walked into the living room to find Lily braiding Edward's hair with a plastic toy comb. He sat cross-legged on the floor, patient, letting the little girl tug at his scalp while she hummed happily. He didn't care about looking foolish. He only cared about her smile. Hazel's chest ached as she watched them, her heart torn between lingering distrust and a tenderness she hadn't felt in years. Another night, after Lily had fallen asleep in a nest of stuffed animals, Hazel heard something even more startling. Edward was humming softly, brushing a strand of hair from their daughter's face. His eyes weren't filled with guilt or obligation. They were filled with wonder. the kind of wonder only a father could have. Hazel leaned against the doorway, her arms crossed, not in defense, but because her heart was too full to hold. She realized then that Edward wasn't passing through. He wasn't pretending. He was here, really here. And that realization scared her as much as it comforted her. For Edward, every moment was monumental. The sound of Lily's laughter, the weight of her small hand in his, even her stubborn refusal to eat vegetables felt like gifts he didn't deserve. He had missed her first steps, her first words, the milestones he could never reclaim. But he would not miss another. Hazel, still cautious, began to soften. She led him into her studio one afternoon, a space she had guarded fiercely. Sunlight poured across unfinished canvases, the air heavy with the smell of paint. Edward lingered over her portraits of women and children, pausing at one that showed a man blurred by shadow, standing outside a doorway, uncertain whether he belonged. Hazel spoke quietly. "I painted that the week after she was born. I didn't know if I hated you or missed you, so I painted both." Edward's throat tightened. He turned, reaching for her hand not with confidence, but with hope. For the first time, Hazel didn't pull away. And in that small, paint-stained room, surrounded by the echoes of her struggle, they both felt it. The beginning of something new. Not perfect, not easy, but real. Life has a way of testing people just when they begin to find their footing again. For Hazel and Edward, that test didn't come in the form of personal arguments or past wounds resurfacing. It came from the outside through the life of another man who once mirrored Edward, in ambition, but had fallen deeper into ruin. Richard Lopez had been Edward's business associate for years. They had crossed paths in boardrooms, shaken hands at conferences, and competed for the same contracts. On paper, Richard was everything a modern success story should look like. Sharp, innovative, powerful. But beneath that polished exterior lurked secrets. Hazel learned of it one evening when she caught Edward reading through the news on his phone, his expression tight. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated before showing her the headline, "Billionaire Richard Lopez faces explosive divorce trial." At first, Hazel didn't think it mattered. Richard's downfall was not her problem, but the details made her stomach twist. He had betrayed his wife, Elia, the mother of his children, with a younger woman named Vanessa. Worse, he had attempted to strip Elia of everything: her finances, her dignity, even the paternity of her twins. Edward closed his eyes as he read, his jaw tight. The parallels to his own past decision with Hazel were undeniable. Another man, drunk on wealth and arrogance, throwing away the people who had stood by him. But unlike Edward, Richard had not stopped himself. He had doubled down on cruelty, believing his money made him untouchable. The courtroom became a stage for Richard's arrogance to crumble. Elia arrived calm and composed, her navy blue dress a statement of strength. She had her evidence prepared: financial records, hidden accounts, even DNA results that proved Richard's lies false. When the judge revealed those truths in front of everyone, Richard's smug confidence cracked. His mistress squirmed in the gallery. And Elia? She sat still, the embodiment of quiet justice. For Edward, watching this unfold was more than gossip. It was a mirror. He saw the path he could have taken if Hazel hadn't walked away, if he hadn't been given the second chance Lily's illness had forced him to face. He saw what unchecked pride could destroy. After the verdict humiliated Richard and left him stripped of both reputation and fortune, Edward returned to Hazel's apartment in silence. That night, as Lily slept, he admitted something to Hazel. "That could have been me. I was one decision away from becoming him." Hazel looked at him, her eyes steady. "But you're not him, Edward. You chose differently now." And for the first time, Edward believed her. In the weeks that followed, their lives settled into something resembling normalcy, though it was a normal Hazel had never imagined years ago. Edward was no longer hovering at the edges of their world, he was inside it. He learned Lily's bedtime routines, knew exactly how much honey she liked in her tea, and carried her drawings in his briefcase like prized possessions. Hazel still worked nights at the diner, though Edward offered more than once to make things easier for her. Each time, she shook her head. "I don't need saving, Edward. I just need support." And to his credit, he listened. Instead of trying to control, he simply showed up. Her art career was slowly growing. A downtown gallery began showcasing her pieces, and word spread about the raw emotion in her portraits. Collectors started reaching out, commissions trickled in, and Hazel began to see a future where her art could sustain her and Lily. Edward quietly cheered from the sidelines, introducing her work to people he knew, but never attaching his name. He wanted her success to be hers alone. One summer afternoon, Lily came bouncing into the living room, carrying her toy unicorn. Its wing had snapped off, and she held it out to Edward with big eyes. "Can you fix it, Daddy?" she asked. The word froze him. Hazel, folding laundry in the other room, heard it too. For a moment, silence filled the apartment, thick and heavy. Edward looked at Lily, his throat tight, and smiled gently. "Of course I can." Hazel braced herself for the ache that word might bring, but it never came. Instead, she felt warmth. The word didn't erase the past. It didn't erase the nights Hazel had spent alone with fevers, bills, and endless doubts. But it meant that Lily saw him now for what he had become, the man who left, but the man who stayed. That night, Hazel lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling while Edward's soft humming drifted from Lily's room. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something she had to survive. It felt like something she could imagine.